I'm gonna say 3, 2, 1.
Hello, my name is Julia Gillard and I am Chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this special event. I know that we are joined by an audience from around the world, which is very gratifying to us. We are a truly global institute, and so I'm very pleased that we have people joining us from the United States, from Singapore, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from the United Kingdom, from Australia, and the list goes on. So thank you for joining us. We are delighted to be presenting this event in partnership with Wellesley College. And as a global institute, we do seek to have partners around the world, and we're delighted with this collaboration. Wellesley, of course, is the alma mater of Hillary Rodham Clinton, and we are gathered now to have a conversation 25 years after she gave a groundbreaking speech, then in her capacity as First Lady of the United States at the UN event in Beijing. Hillary famously said at that event, "Human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights." Now we might think that this is a self-evident statement, but at the time it was a breakthrough that changed the dialogue about gender equality. I am joined by two fantastic panelists to talk about what has changed in the 25 years since Beijing, in particular, what this phase in human history, the days of the pandemic and beyond, mean for women's equality, and what we need to do to build the world that we want to see of true equality for the future. Firstly, I'm joined by Ambassador Melanne Verveer. Now, Melanne has a CV so long I could use the full hour taking you through it, but suffice to say she was Chief of Staff to Hillary Clinton when the Beijing speech was given. She served as the first ever Ambassador for Women and Girls, and she is now the Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. I'm also joined by Paula A. Johnson, who leads Wellesley College. She is a medical professional of great renown, a cardiologist, and she has led a number of important health facilities, including being the inaugural Executive Director of the Connors Centre for Women's Health and Gender Biology. And if we didn't value our health professionals before this year, we very much value them now. I think this year, more than anything else, has taught us something about the value of connection. We haven't been able to be together physically the way we might have wanted to be, but we found other ways of staying in touch. And I know I speak both on behalf of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London and for Wellesley College to say that our alumni have never meant more to us, and thank you for the way in which you've stayed in touch and helped us get through what has been a very difficult period. I am particularly grateful to Rolla Gordon, who is an alumnus of King's College and of Wellesley College, and she's been instrumental in bringing Paula and I together and facilitating us collaborating on this very special event. So now over to the conversation. Melanne, you were there in Beijing when the speech was given. Can you give us a sense about the background to the speech, the political context? What was it like?
Well, thank you, Julia. And before I try to get into that, I want to say what a pleasure it is for me, a personal pleasure to be with you, former Prime Minister, and to be back with Paula, Madam President, now at Wellesley. So it's really a joy to be with two great women leaders today. It was an extraordinary moment. If I can just place myself in the White House where I was with Hillary Clinton at the time as First Lady, we knew that this conference was going to take place. It was the fourth UN conference on women. There had been obviously 3 others that gradually were putting together a platform for women's equality. Each one took on a sense of new urgency. And this one really was focused on equality of women, closing that gap, and really understanding, bringing an understanding about human rights and women's rights. And it had been preceded by a human rights UN conference that took place in Vienna some months earlier. And so we were aware this was truly an important moment for women, American women, but women around the globe, and that we needed to be engaged. We needed to play a leadership role in this. And as it turned out, Hillary was invited by then Secretary General Boutros-Ghali to give a keynote address. And she very much wanted to accept the invitation. But we had a lot of challenges to get to Beijing. First and foremost, we needed to really put together a united posture within the administration that this was an important thing to do. And that is not always easy when you're working with various agencies and trying to come to some consensus about what makes the most sense. One of the things to do was obviously to put together a delegation who would represent the United States, because it was an event that was going to have formal representation from governments. And then there was a parallel conference going on that turned out to have tens of thousands of women from all over the globe, those extraordinary representatives of women's organizations and causes that are still very much at work around the world today and exponentially grown from those years as well. And our delegation, we wanted it to demonstrate both the face of America as well as to demonstrate importance. And so Hillary reached out to then Ambassador Madeleine Albright, who was the US ambassador to the United Nations, and said, really, it would be great if you would lead this delegation, because that would convey how important it truly is that a woman of considerable foreign policy leadership would demonstrate this had to be part of our foreign policy as well. So she came on board. We had powerhouse women like Donna Shalala, who was then Secretary of Health and Human Resources, Jerry Ferraro, who was obviously a personage of some considerable clout in the United States, having been a vice presidential candidate, first woman in that role, and women from across the country. We had a Muslim physician, a Catholic nun, a Florida state legislator who was Hispanic. We had a Black woman who was a woman of achievement in politics as well. But it was America. It was women of achievement from across the country. And we had the former governor of New Jersey, a male, Governor Kane. We wanted to show the fact that we were all in this together. And it was a cause for all of us, men and women from every strata of our country. And so that took considerable effort. It's quick to say it now, but it took considerable effort to really form this group. And then we had all of the ups and downs of really getting our acts together. What was our position going to be? How were we going to proceed, et cetera? There were issues with the United Nations and how it was, whether or not sufficient resources were being put to it, whether or not the challenges were being confronted. But we had our own challenges. And there was tremendous opposition for Hillary going. A lot of it was focused on her. The right, the detractors, said that it was a conference that was going to destroy the family. It was going to create new genders. It was going to do all of these god-awful things. You had the human rights community incredibly divided. The women's community was very much for it. We wanted to advance the goals of equality. But on the other hand, most of the major human rights groups really said, why go to China? They're human rights violators. It happened to be a conference that took place in China. It wasn't about China, but that didn't matter. And then you had the whole America-China bilateral relationship. Was Hillary going to rock the boat? Were people in the State Department nervous about her going? How did we know that this wouldn't precipitate a new crisis? So that was a huge part of the backdrop, this tug and pull. And then things got really bad a couple of weeks before the conference when Harry Wu, a dissident, made his way to China and got arrested. And everybody threw up their hands and said, well, that means we're not going. And we went around the office saying, woo is us. Instead of woe is us, it was a combination of woo and woe. And she was terribly frustrated. In fact, there was a moment of frustration. At this point, she's out west with her husband on holiday before this was to take place in September. That was late August. And she said to me in exasperation, I'm going. Get me my ticket. And obviously it wasn't that easy and it wasn't going to be that possible, but it was a sign of frustration that this mattered so greatly. What it was about truly mattered. Well, long story short, and many months collapsed, we did get to Beijing. We met up with the president and the first lady in Hawaii because he was going on to do events there. Secretary Albright, then Ambassador Albright, had to cut short her participation in her daughter's wedding, sort of the story of American women's lives. And she made her way to Hawaii. And she and the First Lady then got on the plane for us to take off to Beijing. In the process of all of this, the speech was getting written. There were very few people who saw that speech. The president, the First Lady, the speechwriter, Lisa Muscatine, and a couple of others of us on the staff. It was not turned over to the State Department. It wasn't turned over to anybody, in fact, because the great fear was if that happened, everybody would pick at every other word and sentence, and that would turn into something not very impressive or something that really would tone down what she wanted to say. And at the same time, we had the press person in the White House telling the press who asked, well, what about this speech? What will be in it? And really toning it down. He hadn't seen it. He didn't know anything about it. But he said, oh, no, she won't rock the boat. It will be the usual American stance on these issues. And frankly, the West Wing being the office of the president, was also very concerned because we were going into an election the following year. And there was great fear that she was going to be with all of these quote unquote radical feminists out at the non-official part of the conference, the NGO conference. And who knew what would happen there? And certainly they were counseling not to go. But long story short, again, they did get on that flight. We were accompanied by high officials from the State Department, from the National Security Council, Ambassador Albright. Everybody went through the speech. Very few, if any, changes, tweaks here and there. And we made our way to Beijing. And I'm going to really go quickly forward here and get to the speech itself. There was a lot that went on in Beijing, which I will truncate. And when she got up to make that speech, I was behind the curtain to the side, as was our speechwriter. And to say we weren't nervous would be an understatement. We were tremendously nervous because at that point, you could only hear in your head, oh my God, somebody said she shouldn't go. She shouldn't go. It really needed not to happen. Ambassador Albright should have just gone, and that should have been it. And when she got up to speak, the response was kind of slow at the beginning. And first of all, UN conferences, there's very little that's emoted in those conferences in terms of, you're feeling that you're into the substance. And that was nerve-wracking. And the fact that translation happens, so the individual sitting in the audience here's it not simultaneously, here's the interpretation. So you've got, a couple seconds off always. But as she got into the litany of this speech, which was a recitation of abuse of women around the globe, from honor killings to dowry burnings to human trafficking to snuffing out the life of a girl child just because she's a girl, to the violence that happens in your own home, domestic violence. And after each of these abuses, she said, and this is a violation of human rights. And that was a major statement, because in a lot of places, certainly and even in government, these were not considered always human rights violations. Violence against women was not a violation of human rights. It was a private matter. It was a cultural issue. No, it's a criminal matter. It's a violation of human rights. And that's what happened in Beijing. The embeddedness of women's rights as human rights was once and for all, not just in human rights international law, but was the clarion message to the world. Human rights are women's rights. Women's rights are human rights. And when she got to that moment, the place just erupted in this incredible reaction of pounding the table and people standing and cheering. And I had a colleague in government who he had worked at the State Department. He was sent out on an errand, and he said he was rushing back to the hall and he heard this tremendous noise. And he thought, oh my God, something's gone really bad. She's giving the speech. And he said, given what we had gone through to get to Beijing, with all the ups and downs politically, he said, I couldn't imagine what had happened, only to have heard this massive favorable reaction to her speech. The congratulations poured in from the world. Leaders who had told her not to go were applauding her for what she said. The New York Times and the Washington Times, political, ideological opposites in many, many ways, both applauded vigorously. The New York Times said it was her finest moment because across the board, there was this great sense that she stood up for American values. She stood up for something that is truly important. And in many ways, that's where we are today. This was 25 years ago. We're still on the journey. We haven't completed it anywhere in the world, but it was a moment that really began it catalyzed a movement that was already there, but truly sparked it even more. And it has brought all of us, certainly the three of us, to a place where we're continuing to work on these issues of equality.
Thank you so much for taking us in the room. That's been a very special insight. But how far on the journey are we? In your capacity leading the Institute at Georgetown, you've published a major report which analyses what's been achieved over the 25 years. And if people are interested in the link to that report, it's on the chat function now, so people can pick up that link. So, Milan, what would you say has been achieved and what more do we need to do?
Well, Julia, thank you for mentioning the report, because you are obviously part of a group of global women leaders who helped us get into the report and work on a way forward that came out of it. But what we've seen is a very uneven picture, definitely progress. Certainly progress on girls' education, something you're tremendously involved in. We, again, are not where we need to be in terms of parity. In primary education, the gap has more been closed. We don't know what COVID is going to do to that. Secondary, we still have a way to go, but progress considerably from where it was. Violence against women, we know it is an ever-present threat, but there were no laws against it. And out of Beijing came this recognition that states have a responsibility to protect their citizens. And laws were enacted almost everywhere. Again, some of the laws have been robustly enforced. or implemented. So work continues to needs to be done, but there's no doubt tremendous progress in certainly raising the fact that these are criminal actions. Governments were not working on issues like female genital cutting or honor killings, or so many issues that were, by any definition, you would think today, obvious abuses, but they weren't viewed as violations of human rights. And so there's been so much work on everything from child marriage to human trafficking. That has changed considerably. There have been greater efforts to create an end to discriminatory practices. So you can chart the differences in various areas of achievement that begin to move women's equality forward, but obviously still it's uneven. In some places we're far ahead, in other places we're far behind. And what the report does, without taking up more time, we really focused on what are those obstacles that are still making that kind of acceleration of progress after all of these years. You know, the World Economic Forum said it's going to take another 100 years at the pace we're going to achieve economic equality, for example, or even longer. What do we need to do? We need to address norms, attitudes, biases. These are deep, these are deeply entrenched. They continue to hold women back. We need to close that gap between laws that are enacted and laws that aren't implemented. We need to deal with the pushback in our world today, particularly by authoritarian rulers who don't want to see this progress and are making every kind of effort to push it back. So we have a number of ongoing perceptible obstacles that we need to tackle, and then we need to move forward in a much more concerted, targeted way, whether greater efforts with young people, with the private sector, with male allies and traditional leaders. There's a world of solutions that we need to continue to unpack and unleash.
Absolutely. And Paula, I'm going to turn to you now. Having heard Milan take us through not only the history, but where we are now, first and foremost, I presume you would say one way of looking at this is the American delegation goes to Beijing. Another way of looking at it is that Wellesley alumni go to Beijing, Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton, which must make you incredibly proud. But how are you seeing the 25 years since Beijing? And do you think that, yes, progress has been made, but we can also see a bit of a backlash against that progress? How do you analyse that?
So I just want to begin by saying, Prime Minister, Ambassador, it's such an honor to be here with you. And it is just to hear the narrative of what it was like. I can't hear it often enough because it's such an amazing and wonderful moment. And I think it's an inspirational moment. And, you know, when I look back and think about that conference, what it did was really give us the vernacular. Really, it gave us the vernacular to talk about women's rights as human rights. And it was able as well to do something that I think was really quite remarkable, which was really in many ways unite the global North and South and really bring women together in quite a remarkable way. And so, you know, I think I totally agree with Milan about the progress that's been made, and that we still have a long way to go. And there are places where we have slipped backwards. And, you know, you've mentioned the authoritarian regimes that have taken hold around the world. And, you know, I think that as we look in certain areas, particularly in some of the developed countries where certain populations of women, there's been a split, and certain populations where there's been increasing economic disparity, you know, it is really a setup for these regimes. And so it is something that we need to be quite worried about. And I'm going to turn to, as you said, our alumna, Madeleine Albright in her book, Fascism Warning. It can happen here, and we need to be vigilant. And what that means is, in my mind, really touching every single sector, focusing on increasing our representation in our legislative bodies, really thinking about enforcing laws and what is that going to take. And I really think that is going to take, Milan, as you said, both more women and our male allies, because the legislation was the first step. It is pretty impressive to not have had any legislation having to do with violence against women, gender-based violence. And now really it's only 59 countries that don't have the legislation yet, and still, it is still a major, major problem. So, education still, you're right, the levels of primary education, but beyond that, there are tremendous inequities and so much work for us to do. And, I look at kind of where I sit now as a president of a college and think about our roles, where I call our institutions really laboratories for democracy. And how do we really think about educating a next generation with the values, the important values of engagement, responsibility, empathy that we really need to really make change moving forward.
There's actually a question on the Q&A, which is very specifically about what can Wellesley do on this mission? Obviously, you do it by educating women, and clearly educating women who change the world, given the women we've already referred to. But in preparing women for the next 25 years, what do you hope they can achieve, and the contribution that having been at your college will make to that achievement, to the progress for the next 25?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. And, I think about this at two levels. I think about it at the student level. What does it mean to receive an education here? And then what does it mean for, of course, our alumni? And then what does it mean for us as an institution, for what we stand for as an institution? So I'll just start with our students. I think that as we think about focus on the advancement of women and all, quite frankly, it's in our DNA. Our motto is non ministrare sed ministrare, not to be ministered unto, but to minister. And I think that it's a very powerful statement, and one that we inculcate throughout our curriculum, which is heavily involved in not only obviously a liberal arts foundation, but also really about what are values. Civic engagement has become a more and more of a standard and something that we look to as training that next generation. And in fact, as we work on what will become Secretary Clinton's institute here, because every modern day Secretary of State has an institute at his or her home institution, this idea of civic engagement and developing one's voice is central. And I think that's something that has to be purposeful. It doesn't happen by chance. And then the idea that when you leave, this is not the end. And I think the Wellesley women, when they are out in the world, it is about pulling other women up with them. It is about the network. It is about how are we changing the world? And then I'll just get to, the institution. And I think this is where I think overall educational institutions have probably spent less time, but I think as a premier women's college, we've spent time thinking about what are the right partnerships. I think, Julia, our partnership with your institute, our Wellesley Centers for Women, these are very important statements about what education scholarship can really bring to bear. And the scholarship piece is critical as it partners with those who are practitioners, because it's, Milan, you pointed out in your report, data are critical. to how we make change. So our educational institutions have a robust role, and one that must be really understood as the interface of scholarship and then moving that to action.
When we look at the times in which we live, I mean, this year will be remembered, I think, for two big things: for the COVID pandemic, but also for the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that that has reverberated and spoken around the world. I mean, coming first to the pandemic, I mean, there's a lot to be concerned about when we think about the pandemic and gender equality, women's job losses, women being at risk in the caring professions and the front line, women in lockdown suffering greater domestic violence, great deal of uncertainty about whether this will push gender equality back. How are you seeing that to both of you? And do you think that there are some things coming from the pandemic that might be able to be harnessed to better progress gender equality? Are there some things we've learned in this time that we needed to know and that we can take with us? Milan, would you like to talk to that?
Well, I think, Julia, what you did in going through some of those terrible consequences that we've been seeing over the last many months, women truly have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. COVID is an equal opportunity oppressor. It can really attack any one of us in any place that we live, no matter who we are, no matter what, whether we're men or women, etc. But women have disproportionately borne the price of this pandemic. They are 70% and over the health care workers around the globe. They have taken the biggest lumps economically. And we see this severe economic dislocation happening in the United States to the extent that it is the first time in our history that this is being called a she-cession instead of a recession, because the greatest number of job losses have come to women in lower paying jobs, in industries that are most affected, hospitality, retail, etc. And the fact that women's jobs tend to be at that lower end. And that's taken a great toll on women's economic well-being. That has in turn been exacerbated by the home care situation. So you've got in place after place, not just in our country, but globally, children out of school. Women have been taking on that second shift as an equal shift with trying to work remotely or trying to carry on their work outside the home. And again, in the United States, we're finding that more and more women are giving up that work part of their economic participation because of the childcare burden that's been imposed. And then you've got the violence against women, which has upticked everywhere in the world. This has caused such a resurgence of domestic violence. And in the developing world, the consequences are huge with girls out of school, something you pay so much attention to. You've got the prospect that they may never return, but there's greater exploitation going on in terms of trafficking and child marriage and all kinds of abuse. So this aggregate, this disproportional aggregate of bad consequences is something we're going to have to deal with. First, I think now every emergency response that can be garnered has to be done. And we have to put a gender lens on that response because women have been so severely impacted. Secondly, there is the saying that with a crisis comes opportunity. The question will be, will we be able to change these gross inequalities that have been exposed in this crisis and really do things differently? The whole notion of build back better. And I think that is going to be our challenge, to understand that we need to address this. In our own country, we are the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have paid leave. We have not addressed our childcare crisis. It has been on the agenda over and over. We're talking about those great Wellesley alums When Hillary Clinton was First Lady, we really tried to make progress on childcare. That was 20 plus years ago. Now I think these issues have come to the fore in a way where we truly need to do something. So my hope is that we will, if not an opportunity, but a real crisis to get us to do what we need to be doing and should have done all along, so it wouldn't have been as difficult and disproportionate as it is.
And Paula, what do you think?
No, I totally agree. And I think that this is an issue that we could probably talk about for quite a long time, because as we think about what's happening in the world and in the United States, as we think about a global pandemic intersecting with the Black Lives Matter movement and the resurgence of quite a bit of activism, it's a moment of both despair, but also of hope. And, for the pandemic, we shouldn't be surprised. Every pandemic has impacted women more, in just more profoundly, whether it's Ebola, Zika, SARS, you name it. So, we need to have a better lens. And I think, Milan, you're totally right about how we think about our response policies. And this also, quite frankly, goes to response in conflict or response in environmental devastation, because with every single event, we can almost predict what will happen. And what we have not done in a blanket way is actually think about our policies through a gender lens. What needs to be in place? How do we actually prevent what one can predict as an outcome? So I think that to me is fundamental. But as we think about what else we need to consider, the pandemic, at least in the United States, has really laid bare not only the gender inequalities, but the intersection of gender and race and other identities has been really, as I said, laid bare. And this is true pretty much across socioeconomic status, but of course, greatest at the lower socioeconomic strata. And how we move forward on this in terms of thinking about better, just moving forward on economic parity, moving forward on so many of the issues we've talked about. I think the pandemic really brings into focus what it is we need to consider, where we've not made a statement, for example, in our country about the value of women's lives as we live them, through the fact that we have not invested in childcare, we've not invested in family leave. These are things that are so fundamental. And think about what's happening and what is at risk at this particular moment. We are still arguing about whether healthcare is a right. We are still arguing about the right of women to have agency over their bodies. We are still arguing over the right for women's lives to be considered in parity with men's lives. So it's a moment of great reckoning, but as I said, a moment of hope. And I just want to end with one other issue, which is, again, I'm going to get back to the research issue and the data issue. Because if you go back to the beginning of the pandemic, it really was not until around April where we were seeing really any data reported by sex routinely. And for sure, it was later than that when you saw data reported by race, sex, strata. And that is, there are no words for that in 2020, to be honest. This is what I've spent my career on as we've thought about sex differences and how women's health is different and how we don't pay attention. Well, this needs to be a policy decision. It needs to be a global policy decision on how we look at data so that we can address issues. Without data, we can't fix the problem. And therefore, by ignoring stratified data, we are inherently saying that women's lives don't count. So, because men become the norm. So, lots and lots of work to do. And, we do have to take a moment, though, to recognize that countries in which women were leaders or are leaders right now are doing better. And I think it makes a statement again about women's leadership and where women invest. We need more of it.
Yeah, I'd have to say I was originally a little bit sceptical when there was the information coming out or the press reporting around women leaders doing better. The statistician in me wanted to say too small a sample size, which is a problem in and of itself, that we don't have enough women leaders around the world to have a big sample size. And of course, a number of the countries led by women leaders you would think are well positioned to deal with the pandemic because of the nature of their health systems or because they're upper income countries. But there has been some research from the UK now which has disaggregated and come to the conclusion that even comparing similar countries, women leaders have done better, and they posit that that might be because women leaders have been more risk averse and they engaged in lockdown measures early, or they've been more prepared to take the expert medical advice rather than bluster in the face of the virus. And as we know,
I would not put it as risk averse. We followed the science.
Followed the science. Yes. Followed the science because
and
the
be
virus
honest about
really
it.
interested your
Communicate
bluster.
honestly.
Right.
But coming to the other big theme of the year, Black Lives Matter, and Paula, you just touched on it, but if I could get you to sort of keep on that theme. I mean, there has been huge activism around the world, so many calls in countries, Australia, right around the world, for us to truly look at our history, to truly understand what it means for our present and the inbuilt systemic racism in our structures, and to finally address that for the future. Are you optimistic about that? Where do you see the pathway forward?
It's the question about optimism. We have to be optimistic, because if we're not, we won't make the change that's necessary. And I do think it's such an important topic, particularly in light of Beijing, because as we all said earlier, women came together from all over the world. And even though we didn't use the word intersectionality at that time, it's Kimberly Crenshaw who coined that term. I think that is really what we saw at the conference. And this is now a moment in time where we must embrace intersectionality. We must come to terms with and reckon with our histories in order to move forward. And how do we really seize this moment and even widen the movement? Because today it is really thinking about all of women's identities, its race, its genders, the broadening of gender, and how do we move that forward? So I do think that it is a moment, again, as we think about who's in power and how do we keep that pressure on. We've already seen, at least in the United States, some slippage in terms of identifying and really identifying with the movement. But I think it's up to us, to be honest. We have many of us in this Zoom room today, and many of us have positions from all different sectors and have ability to make change. And so while there isn't a singular answer, because if there was, it would have been done, and it's complicated and it's hard, but we all have a piece in this. I have a piece as a college president. I have a piece as a citizen. And I think those in business, those who are running for office or in elected office, how can we really grapple with these issues from these perspectives and really work hard to understand the full scope of perspective? Because none of us lives with the experience of all women, So it takes great listening and embodiment really of the issues. So we all have a role, and, you know, I am optimistic because, as I said, you know, I'm in the business, I always say, of young people, and we do have to really support them and support each other as we go on this journey.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
Because Paul is just so right on and eloquent about it. We at the Georgetown Institute of Women, Peace, and Security, we're in the business of data, disaggregated data based on gender, but really creating an evidence-based case about how much more effective solutions are, particularly in our case, in terms of women and peace and war, to really understand that women make a difference, that evidence-based case difference that's so important to solutions. But we just put out a study last week, and it was called "The Best and Worst States to Be a Woman," looking at the three dimensions that encompass women's lives: inclusion, all the things we've been talking about, economics, politics, education, but also justice, discriminatory practices, and security. Do I feel safe? And what it exposed is not only how bad it is in some of our worst states and still not the best in the best states, but the exacerbation of those inequalities for Black women and women of color, from maternal mortality to educational attainment to pay. It is such a difference. And obviously there are intersectional aspects in all of it. Are you older or younger, or et cetera? But the difference for women of color is just, it has to be addressed. And one of the great positives, I think, that's come out of Black Lives Matter and all the attendant focus on these issues is how much young people really don't want to be in a world of this kind of discrimination and are working to come together. I've taken, as somebody who was active in the civil rights movement years ago, to see how many more people are coming together with people of color to address these issues. And I can tell you one of the projects that we're doing at the university, just in our part of the university, in the Institute, is to focus on international relations curricula. You know, our students are being educated in the School of Foreign Service. How many of different kinds of researchers and authorities in terms of expertise are they being exposed to across the perceptions, across the perspectives, Black authors and experts, women, etc. And so ensuring that the curricula is responsive, and then to see how the young people have embraced this issue. They are calling everybody to task, everybody to justice, and they really want a different kind of world. And Paula talked about we have to have hope. That really gives me hope because I see them much more engaged in greater numbers than I think we've seen in the past.
Yeah. Milan, can I just add, because that is, you're bringing up such an important, again, about the data and the research. And, you know, you mentioned several areas in women's health, which, you know, the health of Black women and Black and brown women has suffered over generations. But I want to make two quick points. One is that we have examples of movement after movement that has marginalized Black women. So everything from suffrage to the civil rights movement to the women's movement. And I think that our focus on intersectionality, as we're naming it, this has got to be this has got to be something that is intentional and active, because it's not going to happen by chance, and it never has. So it isn't something that will just happen. We have to really be intentional. And just another quick point on the health side, because without health, right? I mean, health and economic security, they go together. And what we've seen in terms of lack of funding for the study of women's health writ large, and for the health of racial and ethnic minorities, in particular for racial and ethnic minority women, is astounding. And we have very good data that there is bias at every single level. We're doing a little better. Some of our work in the past has really led to some very serious changes in the NIH policy and FDA's policies around the inclusion of women. But here's a problem. We know today, based on data, that women who submit grants are actually, by the reviewers are biased when they see their names as women. Scientist named Molly Carnes has actually done some really elegant work. We also know, we just finished a study a couple of years ago, a small study, that when women's health, no matter what the subject, when women's health is actually in the title, the ratings of the article for submission are not as high. So I point that out to say that the bias runs deep, and it is going to take active, hard work for us to move beyond it. And I think we have will, so we just now have to find the way.
You know, and that is so true about this bias, conscious or unconscious. And Paula just reminded me of the fact that in so many of our orchestras, we saw very few women musicians because there is an assumption, even unconscious, that she can't be as fine a musician as he could potentially be for the vacancy in a symphony orchestra. And what finally happened is the auditions were taking place behind a curtain. So you couldn't see, was she a she or he a he, but it was based on that expertise and skill. And we've got to get into that color blind, gender blind way of operating where it's your skill and your expertise and the importance of the issue that needs to be studied instead of the unequal way that we are going about it. So there is some progress. It is not enough. And I was also reminded, you know, the first studies on whether or not aspirin, if you have a heart condition, if it is helpful to take aspirin, was done on men. I think the first breast cancer studies were done on men. Yeah. So,
well, the physician health study, which came from my former institution, it was very interesting that the wake-up call to that after the Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas debacle, that led to that first wave of women in Congress in the United States, which led to policy change at the NIH that President Clinton actually signed. And I think it's, again, an example of representation matters. So, yes. You know, it just matters. And, you know, we are right up on an election. It is something we are focused heavily on here in terms of participation, whatever you're leaning. But, you know, our vote here is also at risk, and participation and active engagement, civic engagement, is essential. And it's essential for women.
Amen.
And I do want to, just in light of that discussion, my attention was drawn today to a report put out by Times Up Now on the comparative treatment of Senator Harris in her vice presidential bid versus Tim Kaine, who ran with Hillary Clinton last time, versus Mike Pence. And they've done those word clouds where the most used words after each of them was first came to be a vice presidential nominee. So for Mike Pence, when he was first announced in the last election as President Trump's nominee, the word cloud is experience, safe, reassuring, thoughtful, and the only critical word is extreme. For Tim Kaine, when he was announced as Hillary's vice presidential running mate, the words were experience, safe, nice guy, smart choice. The critical word was boring. for Senator Harris, the positive words were experienced, historic, fearless, but the negative words were nasty, phony, radical, mad, tough, extreme, mean. So telling us just how much these stereotypes are playing out right now. I'm conscious our time is very short, and I do want to take some of the theme that's been coming up in the questions on the Q&A, which is, what about men? There's been some questions like, if we were replicating the Beijing event today, would we have more men at it? Would there be more men on the delegation, Milan, than went to Beijing 25 years ago? What about boys' education so that they grow up to be men who understand that the issues we're talking about now? Here in Australia, there is a lot of thinking about the role of men. There's an active program around male champions of change in the corporate world, but of course there's an endeavour to make sure that's not just a badge people wear with pride, but it's a way that they live and that they are actively changing organisations. But can I throw that to you? What about men? Paula, would you like to start on that? And then Milan.
Absolutely. You know, male allies, I think Milan stated it, male allies are critical in this work. And quite frankly, I think as women in leadership roles, it's our job to identify them and bring them in and recruit them. I think sometimes men don't know how to become involved. And I think we need to be actively inviting them. And I think the need to, because women, right, we have the data, actually the most recent McKinsey study on women in work, women are more likely to be allies around all of these issues. So for the men who are, we need to bring them along. And, you know, around the world, there are so many wonderful examples of really identifying male allies, whether they be in the traditional tribal sense or in others that have been, I think about a program in Malawi where, thinking about maternal mortality, they really worked with the chiefs of the villages, and how you then advance that work. They were critical. So only to say, if it were today, absolutely.
Well, and I think added to that, there is a growing recognition that progress for women is really about progress for everybody.
Right.
And this fact that men benefit from women's equality, again, data is a very big issue, because on the private sector side, the economic world, data is proving what a difference women make on boards, what a difference they make in upper management, what diversity means to the company's bottom line, not just in terms of shared value, and also what a difference it can make beyond the private sector. Take Sweden, which has a parental leave policy that men, fathers, and mothers take advantage of. What is coming out of that experience over many years now, when men didn't want to avail themselves of it initially, is today they're saying, why were we deprived of this time with our newborn? It has changed our lives. I had an experience in India where we were doing a grant for a group of men, illiterate men, to try to end abuse against women in their villages. And they were doing it through skits, because that's what the message they could send, you know, don't lift that arm. And I heard from the head of the project, please come back, they want to talk to you. This was after a year. When I went back, I didn't know what they were going to tell me. And I said to them, the first thing I said, so violence against women is down in your village. Oh yes, oh yes. But that's not what we want to tell you. They wanted to tell me they had changed, and they no longer saw themselves as that machismo version that found abuse just the way they lived. You know, that was the way guys operated. These illiterate men were saying, we have changed and we've seen a whole new side that has made us better people. So this whole part that we all benefit from this, it's not a zero-sum game. Nobody's doing anybody a favor. this is how we need to operate.
Absolutely. There's quite a bit of chat on the Q&A about how people can share this footage with friends who haven't been able to join in the session. So I'll ask the team supporting us to put an answer to that on the chat line, and quite a few questions too about how people can get involved. So we'll make sure that all of the links for Wellesley, for Georgetown, for the Global Institute for Women's Leadership are there. Each of us very much wants to stay in touch and work with good supporters, but our time is growing to an end, so I'm going to conclude with this question to my two very distinguished panellists. Exiting this discussion, to the people who are listening, what would you say gives you hope? What makes you think we're going to get there?
I think collective action, what I'm seeing in terms of the goodwill of people transcending the terrible things we see. The glass is half full. It's not half empty, and we need to keep filling it up.
Yeah, and I would concur with Milan and just say that, you know, we're here talking about the Beijing conference and Hillary's groundbreaking speech 25 years ago. And we've made a lot of progress in 25 years. There have been steps backwards, and we're at a pivotal moment, but it gives me hope that we will continue that forward momentum with all of that we know today. And we will work to accelerate the progress so that we can maybe imagine what it'll be 25 years from now.
And what gives me hope, and I've seen it in my own country as well as in the United States, is that every woman who steps forward definitely makes more space for the women who come after. Here in Australia, we are having a very different debate about gender now than the one we had when I was Prime Minister. The debate has got better. People are more sensitised on questions of gender. And as I watch, particularly the 2020 election campaign in the US, I think whilst there are still many more things to do to make sure that women, whether it's Senator Harris or any other woman who's running in this election campaign, is treated equally, I also think that there is far more sophistication in the understanding of gender discrimination against political candidates, and certainly far more mobilisation by women and men to call it out when it happens. And that gives me a lot of hope that we do learn that the leadership, the insights of figures like Hillary Rodham Clinton, the life she's lived and the space she's created has taken us forward. And to the next 25 years, let's hope we can take even more energy and propel progress ever more quickly. Thank you so much to Paula, to Milan, but thank you most of all to everybody who's joined us for this conversation. It's been great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.